Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our first webinar of the Arbor Day series. My name is Gwen Kozlowski, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. We have many friends of the program here in attendance today, but for those of you who are new to us, the UCF team is a collaborative effort between UVM Extension and the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. We provide technical, educational, and financial assistance to communities in stewarding their tree resources. Before I hand it over to Ethan, I've got a few housekeeping items. Your microphones will be muted during the presentation, but if you have any questions during the webinar, please put them in the question box in the side panel, and we will address them after the presentation. If you have any other comments, feel free to put those in the comment box. Throughout the presentation, I might be adding website links that are mentioned there. Credits. This presentation is eligible for one ISA, SAF, or Vermont Forester licensed CEU. To receive this credit, you must fill out the survey with your name and license number. The survey will pop up once you exit the webinar, and it will also be emailed to you 1 hour after the end of the webinar. So if for some reason it doesn't pop up once you exit the webinar, you will be emailed the survey to complete that for credits. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, VT Community Forestry, later today, and you feel free to share with friends or whoever might be interested. And we are delighted to have so many people on today. We already have 62 people logged on. Today would have been our 5th annual Arbor Day conference, but today this webinar is a great alternative. And thanks to Ethan Tapper, our Chittenden County Forester, for leading this presentation today. He will be focusing on managing town forests. But to get a sense of who is in the audience, I have a few quick polls that I'm going to launch. Let's see, I've never done one of these before. So, all right, who's on this webinar today? I'm going to launch that. Go ahead and select Forester, Conservation Commission, or Town Forest Committee member. You represent a municipality, or just here to learn some more. All right, we've got some responses here. Give it another 10 seconds for people to respond. All right, I'll close that poll. And we had 12% foresters, 40% Conservation Commission or Town Forest members, 10% representing a municipality, and about 40% here to just learn some more. Excellent. Okay, and I've got one more poll. Do you help manage a town forest in your community? Yes, no, not yet, but we're hoping to get something started. All right, another 5 seconds and I'll close this poll. Okay, we've got about 50% yes, 35% no, and 16 not yet, but we're hoping to get something started. All right, and one last one. I'm just curious, how many webinars have you participated in this month? This is my first one, 2 to 3, 4 to 9, over 10. Oh my gosh, there's people saying over 10. I'm very surprised. Wow. I'm not going to lie, this is actually my first webinar this month. All right, 5 more seconds and I'll close this poll. We've got 20%, this is my first one, 33, 2 to 3, 33, 4 to 9, and 15 with over 10. Wow, some overachievers here, I'm impressed. And I wasn't able to do a poll of who's here throughout the state because it only limited me to 5 options, but feel free to add comments in the chat box to say where you're from, maybe your town and your name. We'd love to know who's here. All right. With that, I'll toss it over to Ethan, and thanks so much for your time today, Ethan. Go ahead.
Hey everybody, this is Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. I'm probably in that over 10 group of, I've been calling myself the virtual forester. because pretty much all I've been doing is figuring out ways to connect with people virtually during this time. And I think I've probably led 10 webinars in the last month, which is a lot. But it's been really neat, just getting a different way to connect with people and seeing so many people that want to be engaged with their forest during this time. And so just to give you the brief rundown on who I am, what county foresters do. County foresters are many things, but for the most part, we are the way that the state assists landowners in the management of their private forest lands. So Vermont's 75% forested, 80% of those lands are owned by private individuals and families, and are contributing massively to our economy, to our quality of life, cleaning our air, cleaning our water, providing carbon sequestration and storage, and wildlife habitat and habitat for the pollinators of our agricultural crops, flood mitigation, erosion attenuation, all these other things are part of what forests provide for Vermont, and also bigger things like just making Vermont such a beautiful place to live in, and then also obviously contributing to our economy, billions of dollars every year to our forest products economy, sugaring, forest-based recreation, forest-based tourism. All those things are really, really important. And so it's really, really important that people are managing their forest responsibly and with the long view in mind, and doing so with reference to the fact that they are contributing these massive public benefits, even if they're just managing a small piece of forested land. So it was early in the 1900s when county foresters were given the responsibility to assist with the management of municipal forests, town forests in some way. From county to county now, that the role that county foresters play in managing town forests is really different from county to county. Different town forests, different ecology, different communities, different county foresters who are involved in different projects lead to sort of a non-uniform allocation of county forester time across these town forests, but I'm really into it. And I've only been a county forester. I've been a forester for about, 8 years. I've been a county forester for 4. And I have just started, in the last few years, figuring out how to manage these town forests in a way that I think is really, really good. And so I think I've landed on some stuff that's really exciting, but obviously many of you are also professionals who are involved in the management of these municipal lands. And so I would love to hear your thoughts as well. So with that, I will start the presentation. So managing town forests in Vermont, this is meant to be sort of an introduction to an overview to the management of how we manage our municipal forested lands. We'll go through the history of town forests in Vermont, planning, why we would manage, implementation, and then follow up and follow through. So those of you who have seen me present before know that I always sort of couch what I'm saying in a historical context, because that's so crucial to the forests that we have today. It's important to understand that almost uniformly across our landscape, our forests have been cleared in the early 1800s as a result of many different things: Napoleonic Wars, increase in textile markets, merino sheep being very, very valuable. The majority of Vermont's landscape by the early mid 1800s was cleared. So about 80% we think was cleared, which basically means that every forest you've ever been in, except for high elevation, very remote, extremely inaccessible forests, were probably pasture at that time. Forests develop as systems over hundreds and thousands of years. And so while we may have trees that are 100 years old and are really big in our forests as systems are basically babies. They haven't had a chance to develop the full range of attributes that we would associate with old growth forests, which probably covered in excess of 90% of Vermont's landscape 200 or 300 years ago. George Perkins Marsh, just gonna pull this over here. Really interesting guy. You guys have all probably heard his name. He was an author, he was a congressman, ambassador, philosopher, conservationist. He wrote a book on camels at one point. He did kind of everything. And he has this really interesting perspective because he was born in 1801 in Vermont, and saw this massive wholesale landscape clearing, which for the most part took place in the 1800s through about 1850. And he wrote this very early conservation text called Man and Nature in 1864, basically describing the huge and devastating influence on the way that we were managing the land at that time, and its effect on soils and waters and wildlife and more. He said famously, "We have felled forest enough everywhere, in many districts far too much." And so early town forests really followed up the public forest movement in the late 1800s. The enabling legislation for town forests to be acquired by municipalities was passed in 1915. In 2015, we passed 100 years with that statute. The original statute describes municipal forests as being a tract of land primarily devoted to producing wood products, maintaining wildlife habitat, protecting water supplies, providing forest recreation and conservation education. Those are definitions which still are very appropriate for the town forests we have today. So we have, those early town forests. In many cases, they were specifically for managing water supplies in many cases, or for just aggregations of like tax derelict, old hill farms that went out of business, didn't pay their taxes. And now, in many cases, these are sort of broader conservation projects that form our more modern, new additions to our town forests in Vermont. But those definitions of all of those different resources that town forests provide is still very appropriate. Now, the state was much more involved in the management of these town forests early in this process. So the state would initially pay for a portion of the reforestation costs. In many cases, they were paying for planting these conifer plantations, Scots pine, Norway spruce, white pine, red pine, and also for acquisition costs. They also were some really interesting early laws, of a whole bunch of them related to the management of town forests. In 1951, Vermont passed a law where if you didn't have a town forest, every town had to put an article concerning whether you should get a town forest in the warning for your town meeting. So basically forcing communities to at least think about getting a town forest. And these early statutes also give the commissioner of the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, that's FPR, some advisory and management authority over town forests. So initially, a county forester would or the commissioner would visit and declare a town forest suitable to be, or a potential town forest to be suitable, and then they'd be eligible for all this funding and for a specific designation. Now that, again, the role that county foresters play in that is much less uniform, but they're required statutorily to assist towns in the management of their municipal forests in some way for no charge. Again, I'm going to just move my little box over here. So town forests in Vermont today are really different. So the designation of being a town forest, and me going out to like a town forest, a potential town forest, and waving my hand and saying this is suitable to be a town forest, it's no longer a meaningful designation. It's maybe it's very meaningful, but it doesn't entitle you to additional funding, to additional benefits. A town forest is essentially just any piece of forested land that a municipality owns. And so throughout this presentation, you'll hear me refer to them as town forests, community forests, municipal forests, natural areas, conservation areas, country parks, and more. Those all, as if they're a forested area that's owned by a municipality, they're a town forest. There doesn't need to be any sort of further official designation. Many of the new, so like I said, many of these older town forests were either acquired by towns outright to address a need, like to manage a water supply. And here in Chittenden County, there's a few old town forests, the Milton Town Forest, Saxon Hill Town Forest, and Indian Brook, which are both in Essex. Those were acquired basically to protect water supplies for those growing communities. In many cases, towns just sort of ended up with them. These early town forests, like the Heinsberg Town Forest, were just a bunch of hill farms that all went out of business, and that land ended up with the town. Newer town forests are acquired much more intentionally. So in many cases, when we're seeing new town forests come online, like the Andrews Community Forest in Richmond, the Catamount Community Forest in Williston, the Westford Townlands, the Mapleshade Town Forest in Westford, these are often partnerships with conservation organizations like the Vermont Land Trust, the Trust for Public Land, and utilizing grants from a variety of different sources. And usually the result of that is that the properties pass into the town's ownership and are permanently conserved. Today's town forests, whatever they're called, are managed for a whole different variety of uses. Often recreation is a huge use, but many of them are sort of also managed with more of a hands-off approach, where there's maybe some recreation and exploration, but it's not a guiding use. This is the slide that I really liked making that I was showing Gwen earlier when I was making this. Town forests are cool. So what I think is so amazing about town forests, and why I really, really like managing them, one of the reasons, is because I think it's such a democratic form of public land ownership, and on a micro scale. So you may have some engagement with your state lands or your federal lands, and there are processes that are put in place to ensure that you can actually participate in the planning process. But that's a different level of engagement than the engagement that you will have with a town forest, where it's basically managed by a community committee or commission, conservation commission, a town forest committee, something like that, that you can just join, and they're always looking for members, and it's just a bunch of volunteers who are making decisions about how to manage these forests. And as a citizen, not even on that committee, you can show up to those meetings. They're usually guided by Vermont open meeting law, unless it's an ad hoc committee, and just make your voice known, and you can have a huge influence over the way that you manage these forests. They are accessible. The management of them and the guiding principles that govern them are accessible in a different way. And so as a result, what you see is these town forests, which are varied in their uses and also really reflective of the communities that they're a part of. So one of the really important things to think about, excuse me, and again, this is reflecting my recent experience where I've been very involved with the planning and the management of a bunch of different town forests. Planning is a really important place to start, and there's a bunch of different reasons for that. So the planning process itself is really valuable, I think. It's not just sort of something that we're doing just because we feel like we have to. I think it's actually an opportunity to ask the question, how can this town forest serve as the greatest potential community resource for our community, both culturally and ecologically, to engage people with the town forest? A lot of people in these communities, maybe they have a town forest, and this is the case for several communities in Chittenden County. They have a community forest, but most people don't know that they have a community forest. They don't know where it is. They don't know what it offers their community. And form a more articulate vision for how to manage it for maximum good. So also in many cases, these town forests may have been managed basically just sort of in this ad hoc way, but never gone through a really formal planning process, which just means that the uses and the navigating different uses and navigating, what opportunities there are hasn't been coordinated, hasn't been thoughtfully done, and so they might be sort of missing out on some opportunities to do some really cool stuff. And so just having sort of an abstract process is really, really important for that. That actually engages people. It's also an opportunity to sort of lay the groundwork for future demonstration and engagement, let people know that stuff is happening at the town forest. And so the first thing that I always ask or advise communities to do is to make a management plan. So the really important thing about a management plan, and I would define a management plan as being what I would call a, quote unquote, vision document, describing sort of overarching broad goals and objectives for a piece of town-owned land. I would say that the really important part of this is you're specifically dictating, this is what's happening on our town forest. This is what, these are how these different uses, these are the different allowed uses, maybe some uses that are not allowed, and this is how they're going to interact. A lot of times conflicts is between, two different user groups interacting and not being able to share space, or just sort of conflicts that have not been, that would be potentially easy to resolve and mitigate, but have not been ever addressed formally. I really like to advise the use of a public process. So having public meetings, maybe online paper surveys, public walks and events. So these are all things that can be done essentially for free with volunteers within your communities. In many cases, it can be helpful if you're engaging in a management plan management planning process, that you have like a steering committee that maybe has different community volunteers on it who can sort of guide this process and help it along. That whole process is itself valuable because it lets people, sort of be aware of what's going on and feel like they've had an opportunity to share comments on what's going on in their community, how their town forest is being managed, which is really, really important. There is you don't have to start from square one for any of these things, because there's this really cool tool called the Town Forest Recreation Planning Toolkit, which was created by Gwen and others, Kate Forer especially, at the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry program. It's a partnership between Forest Parks and Recreation and UVM Extension. They got this grant and created this really robust planning process, including tools specifically for public engagement, for how you craft this public planning process so that you're engaging people in a lot of different ways. And that's free to use, and I'm sure that Gwen will share links to that after this. Some communities who are more well off can also hire a consulting firm, like some of the communities that I worked with one called SC Group, but many are not. And so you can just use those tools provided by UCF and just use your volunteer time. Now, so I would split up the management planning process into two different things. So you're creating a management plan. The management plan is saying, it's this governance document. How are we going to manage this forest sort of broadly? What are the uses that are allowed? What are the goals? What are sort of the overarching goals and objectives of the town forest, and that will guide our management of it in a day-to-day respect. But I also think it's important to have a forest management plan. So a forest management plan differs from a management plan in that the forest management plan is developed by a licensed forester. It has very detailed recommendations and specific recommendations on how to manage your forest. So if you're managing it if you want to manage it in any kind of like a scientific, holistic way, you really need more information. It's not sort of these broad strokes, we're going to do a selective cut at some point. It needs to be very specific and intentional in order to do right by your forest. You could ask your county forester to do that. Many county foresters write some forest management plans. I do. I can't do them all. Many other communities hire a licensed consulting forester to write their forest management plan. If you want recommendations of licensed consulting foresters, you can also ask your county forester, and we all carry lists of the foresters that commonly work in our counties. And I would include a forest management plan as an attachment or appendix to the management plan. In many cases, we go through this huge planning process to make a management plan, and then I later, take those recommendations within the management plan of those sort of broad overarching goals and objectives, and I use that to create a forest management plan later. And it does not replace the management plan. It just provides, it's an appendix or it's an attachment providing specifics about how we're going to manage the forest. So an example of a public planning process, the Westford Town lands. So the Westford Town lands, there was that property, the Misty Meadows Trails and Forests, which you can see that sort of southern or southeastern block highlighted by that green line. That was a property behind the Westford School on Brookside Road. It's about 70 acres, has been owned by the town for a long time, or is actually owned by the school district and then deeded to the town when they consolidated. Across the street, a couple years ago, the Vermont Land Trust led the charge in acquiring a new town forest, what is now called the Maple Shade Town Forest. And so we saw the opportunity to actually, if we were like, well, we need to engage in this public planning process for the Maple Shade Town Forest to get a management plan. So why don't we do the same thing for Misty Meadows Trails and Forests at the same time? They present a really interesting sort of duality that we now call the Westford Town lands, because Maple Shade Town Forest didn't have a recreational trail network. Hunting was allowed in theory. And in Misty Meadows Trails and Forest, no hunting was allowed, and there was a really established recreational trail network. So there was an opportunity for those two pieces of land to balance each other. In service of this, we had walks with local natural resource professionals like myself. In that picture on the left, you see Dave Adams, who's a Vermont Fish and Wildlife biologist. He's also a Westford resident. who volunteered their time and basically engaged the public to walk these pieces of land, talk about maybe the sites that were kind of sensitive, talk about the opportunities for different types of management, and at the same time just continuing to engage the community in the fact that we were doing this planning process. On the right, you'll see what we call dot democracy. So at the 4th of July in Westford, they had the opportunity for people to just come by their booth and put a dot denoting the uses that were important to them. And this is a strategy that's also used in UCF's Town Forest Recreation Planning Toolkit. The idea of people just being able to, they don't have to show up for a presentation and like get in a line and say, I like this, I don't like this, but they can actually just sort of stop by in some sort of other public event and just put a dot saying this is important to me. And they also did a survey that was available at the town office and the post office, both in paper form and then also in online forms, to sort of give people, allowing people a lot of different opportunities to engage in different ways. Another example of this, another example of this is that of sort of balance, using this public process and balancing different uses is the Heinsberg Town Forest. So I mentioned that there was sort of this opportunity with the Westford Town lands. We had one piece of land where certain things are allowed, other piece of land where those things are not allowed, but other things are allowed. And so there's an opportunity to sort of have a management balance for people who have different values and are interested in different things. The Heinsberg Town Forest in 2012 went through this huge management planning process. And part of what their result was as well was denoting 3 different zones. So there were some people who wanted very intensive management and recreational trail development of the town forest, some people who wanted no management, and some people who wanted in between. And so what they did is basically split the town forest up into 3 different areas. One area that allows more intensive recreational trail development and more intensive forest management, mostly on the sites of old conifer plantations that had already been intensively managed. An intermediate area, and then a low intensity zone, which is essentially a reserve zone in which no forest management will occur and very, very, very minimal recreational trail development will occur. So here's a bunch of planning recap and other points that I wanted to get to. A steering committee can be very helpful in the planning process. It's really important to, and you can take members from other committees in order to make that steering committee. That's often what's done. You can use a public process because, again, there is value to engaging people around town forests in general. And so providing lots of different ways for people to participate is really, really important. It can also be important to identify partners and stakeholders in that planning process and engage with them directly. You don't have to do everything yourself. And that management planning process should define, again, broad goals and objectives, interactions between different user groups, what's allowed and what's not allowed. It should also identify a governance structure. So who's responsible for overseeing the implementation of the management plan? Who's responsible for ultimately managing the town forest? Usually this is a town forest committee, which can be either an official town committee or a subcommittee of a conservation commission or an ad hoc committee, usually not ad hoc, but sometimes the steering committee is an ad hoc committee. Who do you go to when people have different requests for different uses they want to do at the town forest or problems? Again, specifying that it's important to have this management plan as this broad document and a forest management plan which is different. I would say that if in your community you can't just get it together to do this whole huge public management planning process and also a forest management planning process, you can ask your county forester to just write a forest management plan that's really detailed, or your licensed consulting forester, and then do a lot of outreach around that. But you shouldn't be managing your forest without a forest management plan, which is developed by a licensed consulting forester. And then at the end of that process, for both the management plan and the forest management plan, what you want to do is you want to get select board approval. So you want to pass it to the powers that be. You want to show them that you've engaged the community and had this really robust public planning process. And then when you start doing stuff that's in your management plan or in your forest management plan, the select board has adopted it. They've approved it, and you can say, this plan, what we want to do here, and the way we're managing our town forests has been adopted by the town effectively, which I think has a lot of power to it. So why might we want to manage? those of you who know me know I'm a bit of a tinkerer, so I'm interested in thinking about this question of what is a positive role that humans can have, a symbiotic role that humans can have in our forest while managing them actively, and while also thinking about the importance of, I think, properly managed. I think the forest products that come out of forests are amazing, local renewable resources. Move my box over here again. Excuse me. So why would we manage? We might manage to improve the health and the function of the forest in some way. So to in some way make our forest healthier. Again, one of the really important things to think about as we sort of think about the land use history of our forest, again, is that our forests are really young. This usually results in the fact that they are much less diverse, both in terms of species, having less species of trees, less species diversity, and then also structure. So having a forest which features less different sizes and ages of trees than old growth forests do. And that there's actually an opportunity for us to intervene in that forest to make our forest more diverse, which I think is a really exciting way that people can interact with actively managing their town forests. We can do management to improve the usage of the forest for recreation or for some other use, to provide wildlife habitat conditions that are underrepresented across the landscape. Just like our forests, our landscapes haven't yet had the time to sort of reassume this natural mosaic of different habitat types. And so in the short term, what we can do is create basically disturbances to promote those different habitat types. We can do it to address the threat, to deal with invasive plants, climate change, emerald ash borer. It can also be used, I would say, in conjunction with one of these other uses outlined above, to generate income or to generate resources that we can use for some cool project in town. And the thing that I'm really, really excited about with town forests is that we can also use them to demonstrate how to do all of these things in a way that's really responsible. So in that way, it can be useful not just for our town forest, but then also by doing a really robust outreach process around the management that we're doing, we can really improve the management of private lands, just exposing to people to what good management looks like. So providing for wildlife habitat, again, making our forests more diverse is the best way to provide really, really good wildlife habitat. For instance, we're here looking at a black-throated blue warbler. Black-throated blue warblers require a shrub layer, a layer of young forest in the understory of a forest, usually as part of a structurally diverse, multi-layered forest canopy in order to nest and reproduce. This is true for many birds. So there are birds that require an intact canopy, birds that require, sort of a dense mid-story, really dense understory, pockets of young forest, and birds that require all of these things mixed together. So having a mix of all these things, which in general we do not have across our landscape, is really, really important for promoting wildlife habitat. There are also, I mentioned, specific wildlife habitat conditions that may be underrepresented across our landscape. So an example of this is young forest. So we think that prior to European settlement, large-scale disturbances, big, multi-acre blowdowns and insect and disease outbreaks, ice storms, stuff like that, weren't very common across our landscape, but they were more common than they are now. And so what we're seeing is that many of these birds that require this type of habitat are in decline, and there's work that we can do to actively manage for that habitat that can be really positive. And I'm gonna, again, move my little box thinger. Oh, I can just hide it. I'm gonna do that. So also we can talk about mitigating forest health and threats. So one of the biggest threats is climate change, right? Which is sort of this uniform threat to our forests, which will threaten them in many ways and provide many unique stressors. So one of the ways that we can make our forests more resilient to climate change, number one, by removing invasive exotic plants, allowing our forest natural processes to occur unimpeded by these plants, which basically prevent them from doing everything that forests do and providing every benefit that forests provide. We know that multi-aged forests store more carbon than even-aged forests, and we know that forests which are multi-aged are also more resilient to, or we expect them to be more resilient to the effects of climate change and also to natural disturbance events. It can also help us create situations like in response to emerald ash borer to create some more regeneration of ash, to diversify our gene pool so that we hope to cultivate some more resistance so we can retain ash as a species. Oh, and another way that we can sort of help our forests be better equipped to respond to threats, forest health threats, sort of miscellaneously, is to thin them. So, you know, trees, especially in the even age forests, which we disproportionately have across our landscape, the trees are competing with each other very aggressively. This is a natural process in which, you know, some trees, individuals win, some lose, but the process of competition is itself very stressful. So cutting the trees that are competing with our healthiest trees eliminates that stressor on our healthiest trees and gives them more sort of tools or energy to respond to all the other stressors that are coming down the pike from climate change and other things. There can also be these, so again, forests managed well are incredible. And so, you know, the sort of wholesale condemnation of forest management basically related to people doing it in a bad way, and people doing it in other parts of the world and other parts of the country in a way that's not sustainable and not respectful of like sensitive resources and just in general the way that forests grow and develop naturally. The condemnation of that, I think, has led to, in many cases, the condemnation of like local wood. But if we're harvesting in a way that's making our forests more diverse and vibrant and abundant in terms of all these resources that they're producing, and really, really, you know, steering them back towards being more like old growth forests, for instance, the resources that we're producing while we do that are like amazing. And it's these local renewable resources that we're harvesting from a living system while making it healthier. I can't think of a resource that'd be better than that. And a really good example of sort of celebrating that resource is what Heinsberg did in 2007. They took their town hall floor, which was, I think, Douglas fir from like 1901, and it was wearing out. And they went to their town forest and said, okay, what can we cut here in a responsible way? There was a lot of ash that there was an opportunity to cut. They cut it, they processed it locally, and created this whole outreach process around celebrating the fact that they were harvesting this wood locally from their town forest and using it to give a new floor to their town hall. Really, really cool. And then general education and demonstration. So a lot of the work that I do is just really, really, really trying to explore and highlight the work that we're doing and presenting the concept of forest management and all the things that are associated with forest management, invasive species management, wildlife habitat management, to different people in a way that they might not have heard about it before, and help them understand how they can manage their forests in a way that is actually positive. This is a really, really important part of all of the work that I do at town forests, and I think that we should think of it as an opportunity for any town forest to do management that benefits our town forests themselves, but then also sort of provides this greater benefit to the broader community and to our landscape. So for more info on management, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about specifics in a second. More info on specific management, you can contact your county forester. If you live in Vermont, all of you have one. Also, licensed consulting foresters, those are private foresters that work for private landowners. There are also, in most communities, you know, some natural resource professionals, wildlife biologists, ecologists, people who work for land trusts, people who work for conservation organizations. Land trusts and conservation professionals themselves are really, really important resources. Property is conserved. And then also connecting with organizations with common goals. So a lot of these, Vermont Woodlands Association, Vermont Coverts, Audubon Vermont, Vermont Land Trust, all of us, especially right now, are trying to provide resources for you to learn more about how to manage town forests, how to manage forests and ecosystems in general with respect to all of these different things. And so following them on social media, if you have that, signing up for their e-news, signing up for their email lists. I would also add that I keep an email list, and if you email me, I'll put you on it. We're all just trying to provide you more information about how to manage forests responsibly. Some other resources that we can share with you afterwards as well. VTcutwithconfidence.com is an amazing resource created by the state that guides you through the process of active forest management from sort of the beginning to the end in a really, really good way. OurVermontWoods.org is this comprehensive clearinghouse for all these different things, resources on management, whether you're a landowner, municipality, etc. BT Invasives isn't on this list, but btinvasives.org is an incredibly important resource for identifying and understanding how to manage many of our invasive organisms. And then the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources Atlas and the BioFinder map are two streaming map services, which we can provide you links to sort of see how your property fits, see if there's any particular rare, threatened, endangered species or unique natural communities, or to see how your property fits into the broader landscape. So once we've got all that planning done, how do we actually do it? And so again, I'm really excited about outreach. I think that this is a huge opportunity for town forests to be sort of demonstration forests. I begin planning and doing outreach on forest management, active management, no matter what it is, probably 4 to 6 months before we start harvesting. And again, like that public planning process, like the planning process that went into the management plan, that the process of publicizing the forest management plan and publicizing the management plan also have inputs into this process, because now it's an outreach around saying, okay, this is something that's in the management plan or in the forest management plan that is adopted by the select board, and now we're going to do it. And then I do a whole nother round of outreach. And again, the goal is a process that is open, transparent, and inclusive, and that gives people time to react. So people are much more understanding about things that they may find uncomfortable if they're not surprised. That's a super, super important thing to understand about this. And think about how to reach out to people in different ways. So not everybody is going to engage with the planning process in one way. And sometimes what I've found, and I'll talk about more specifics about this in a second, that just providing different ways for people to engage, you get more people and you get different people. And so think about public walks, educational events, press releases, stories in local newspapers and town newsletters, talks and presentations at libraries, schools, town events. I've done all of these things, and I get different people at each one of them. So the process that I've just sort of am wrapping up now is at the Heinsberg Town Forest. I bet there's some Heinsberg people listening to this, watching this right now, where we've been harvesting, engaged in an active timber harvest as prescribed in a forest management plan over the last 2 winters. And so winter number 1, I did a lot of walks starting in the summer. So I did a walk that was on a Saturday afternoon, which was focused on just looking at the area that was to be harvested. I then did another walk in the autumn where I looked at the area that was to be harvested with all the trees that I marked. So these are each individual tree, and each area of trees we're doing some sort of like patches. So people could ask questions about them and say, why is that tree marked? Why is that tree marked? Why do you have that area flagged out to be cut? And so sort of like leading people up to every step in the process. And then I had a number of educational walks during that first winter of harvesting itself. What I realized after that winter was that, again, it's really, really important to engage people in different ways. So I started having themed walks, so walks that focused on wildlife, walks that focused on the interaction of forest management and recreation, because the Heinsberg Town Forest is a huge recreational resource. Walks that focused on carbon, walks that focused on birds, with professionals in those fields. And what I found is that we got much better turnouts because, someone whose ears don't prick up at hearing, forest management walk, come look at this active timber sale, are interested in wildlife and are interested in birds and are interested in carbon or one of these other things. So providing sort of different, even though a lot of the information that I was conveying was similar or the same, providing different opportunities engage different people. I also tried to get really creative about it and provide learning opportunities for people who didn't or couldn't necessarily go for a walk in the woods on a Saturday afternoon. So we did these indoor events. I also did a couple of presentations at the Heinsberg Library, one in association with Vermont Audubon about managing forests, specifically with bird habitat in mind. And then a couple of these other events. The one you're seeing on the left is a Heinsberg Town Forest History Night that we did after the first winter, where we got together all the foresters and the logger who had been working to manage the town forest over the last 30, 40 years. and we just sort of talked about the history of the town forest and what it looked like and how we got where we are today. The one on the right you see is that logger who managed the town forest for 30 years with a chainsaw and a skidder in association with those foresters, and who is now, Bill Torrey, who is now a Moth Story Slam champion storyteller and author, and he came out and did a storytelling night, and it was just sort of a way to engage different people and again still plug the management work that we're doing at the town forest. We got about 80, 100 people at both of those. We also generated income. So the income from that job also funded invasive plant control at La Platte Headwaters Town Forest. That's another town forest in Heinsberg. Some of it went to road work to improve access on one of their access points so people can get in with cars more easily, which we're doing right now. Some of it went to Fellowship of the Wheel, who's a local mountain bike trail organization who maintain the recreational trails out there. And some of it was set aside for hopefully future formal conservation of the Heinsberg Town Forest. And then we're hoping to also put up some educational signage following the work that will highlight it for the long term, so that, after this process, people who didn't engage with the process, but they're, biking by and they're wondering what happened, that they can have some context for that. So if you're doing forest management, and I'm talking about specifically the harvesting of trees in a scientific and thoughtful way in accordance with the forest management plan, these are some things you should know in general. You should have the management work in your town forest supervised by a licensed consulting forest or a licensed forester, either your county forester or a licensed consulting forester. And what foresters do is basically be experts on managing forested land, so you don't have to be, understanding about the way that logging works and the way that forest management works is really, really detailed and intricate and specific knowledge, and so it helps to have an expert on your team. So they'll act as an agent of the town. They will mark the individual trees to be cut in accordance with your forest management plan, so you're complying with that plan. They'll find a logger that they trust and sign them to a fair contract that protects the town, their interests, and make sure they're paying fairly for the wood. They'll supervise the logger to make sure that they're doing everything they're supposed to be doing. They're complying with the contract. They're paying for the wood correctly. They're cutting only the trees they're supposed to be cutting, all of these things to basically make sure that everything is happening how it's supposed to be happening. And they'll supervise the follow-up. So the closeout of the job, closeout is the restoration of the trails and basically stabilization of everything for the long term that may have been destabilized by the logging, to make sure that everything is above board in the long term. And then after you do management, there's this whole process of what I call follow up and follow through. There's opportunities to even engage further beyond when you're actually doing the work. I talked about educational signage and materials highlighting the work that was done. You could also have follow-up educational opportunities where you go out and see how the areas that have been managed are responding to the work that you've done over time. I think there's a lot of opportunities to create really cool visualization, citizen science, stuff like that. I'm really interested in this idea of photo posts. So these are posts where someone can put a phone or a camera and take a picture of the same exact spot over time and see how that area develops through different seasons and sort of as it responds to the work that we're done. Most of the forest management that we're doing, it doesn't involve planting trees. It involves just basically creating and driving these natural disturbances to create different conditions in the forest as it regenerates naturally. And so watching that change can be profound, and it's amazing to see year after year these pictures of forests as they respond to something like that. I think it's important to follow up with stakeholders, so anybody who is involved in the process itself of the management. And then also I think that there's a lot of opportunity to write an article, to have a press release, to have a public presentation celebrating the work and its completion. So the important thing is with all this stuff is this is management that we're not ashamed of. This is stuff we're really proud of, and we want to highlight it. And we want people to know that we did it, and we want to continue to provide opportunities for people to learn about demonstration and how to manage their forest well moving forward. Here are some resources that, again, we can link to. Some of these I mentioned in an earlier slide. Cut with Confidence, vtcutwithconfidence.com, Arbor Vermont Woods, vtinvasives.org. this is an old slide, so it says, stay tuned on the site for the rollout of the Vermont Recreation Planning Toolkit at vtcommunityforestry.org. That kit has now been released, so you can search for Vermont Recreation Planning Toolkit. I'm sure Gwen will link to it as well, to get those tools about how to engage in this public planning process, and it's a really, really cool tool. And then there's also this amazing, really comprehensive guide for town forest management. I was doing some town forest event with the commissioner of Forest Parks and Rec, and I was like, there is no guide, I'm just making this up, you know, there's no definitive guide to managing town forests. And he was like, actually there is, and we wrote it in like 2012. And so it's this, and it's amazing. The Vermont Town Forest Stewardship Guide has a lot of really, really good resources on it. And with that, I think that I am gonna stop sharing my screen, and I would love to take some of your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ethan, for walking us through that. We do have a few questions already in the chat box, but please feel free to type in your questions right now. So first of all, this video will be recorded, and we will post it later today on vtcommunityforestry.org. And as well, I think you might be sent a link, but I'm not positive on that. But feel free to email me if you can't find it. I will be asking Ethan for his presentation slides to post those as well. Some folks are interested in that. And I did post a lot of the links that you had mentioned, Ethan, in the chat box. And I did just want to correct you. Kate Forer was the complete lead here on the Town Forest Toolkit. So she was our fearless leader in creating that incredible and comprehensive guide. And just for a little bit more background on that, it was a 2-year or 3-year project. Where the first year, there's a couple components. The first component was 10 sample communities had applied to be part of the process, and they actually walked through the entire public planning process that you had mentioned, and that walked away with their town forest stewardship recreation plans. And as part of the toolkit, there are case studies from each of those communities highlighted with stories of success and how each one is a little bit different and representative of different areas across the state. So it is an excellent toolkit that's comprehensive from start to finish, from advice on how to form your steering committee to implementing your action plan. So Kate really led the work there, and it's an incredible resource to help you get started.
Yeah, she sure did. Yeah, she did an amazing job.
And then a few other questions have rolled in. So Ruth was from Northfield was curious about the percentage of Vermont town forests that have easements. Do you happen to know that?
I don't know the percentage. No, I mean, we don't even know really. It's sort of funny. We because there's no official designation, we don't even really know how many towns have town forests or how many town forests there are or what the total acreage of town forests are. So I think in 2015, in association with that centennial celebration of that initial enabling legislation that allowed towns to acquire town forests, it was figured out by somebody that 168 towns in Vermont had town forests, but I know that that's increased, greatly in the years since then, in the last 5 years, and that many towns have multiple town forests. I would say that every new town forest that I know of, so this is a town forest that is newly acquired by a town, has a conservation easement. And I would expect that that's a pattern that has, is over the last probably 20 years or so. It's just sort of the new way that we acquire town forests or what I would look to. My first call, if I saw an opportunity for a town forest, is I would call either Vermont Land Trust. In my area, that I would call Bob Heiser, or I'd call Kate Warner at the Trust for Public Land. 2 amazing organizations, 2 amazing people who are really, really good at assisting communities through this process. And I would, say they would be my first stop. And as part of their involvement, conservation would be a part of that acquisition and a part of the funding. That's part of the way that we fund these projects.
Great, thank you. And Robert had a question about your experience using town forests as sites for both citizen science and research collaborations with universities. And you touched on that a little bit about using town forests as experiences to reach out to different audiences. Anything else you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I just think that it's sort of what you do on a town forest, I think, is sort of a capacity issue. you know, but I think there are incredible opportunities, again, because it's public land, but it's public land that can be managed in a way that's like much more agile than perhaps a state land where if we were doing any significant management to, you know, for citizen science, we would have to be involved in like a larger and longer term planning process. So you can just like show up to the Hinesburg Town Forest Committee and be like, hey, I'm really interested in like you studying this thing, and they might be like, okay, and you can just kind of go and do it. So I think that's a really interesting opportunity, like having an area that is A, public, and B, a little bit more accessible perhaps than other areas of public land. And so yeah, I would recommend, you know, I certainly seek those partnerships with UVM, especially with local conservation organizations. And right now we're in the process of implementing a grant on some of these town forests to try and get some more citizen science going. But I think it's a really cool opportunity that we're not doing enough of on town forests. We should be doing more.
Great, thank you. And Ruth, again in Northfield, had a question about when town forests provide timber income, what is the typical use of those funds? And I know you had mentioned the Hinesburg town example.
Yeah.
How many of those towns share their proceeds with conservation commissions? And when they do, what percentage goes back to conservation and the town forest, and what percentage goes to the general fund? So
there's no rule. So yeah, basically I think there is actually a statute that pertains to this, which basically just said that the revenue from the town forest will go into the coffers of the town. And so, but this is really important. So in your management plan, I should have mentioned this before, in your management plan, you should specifically say where revenue that is generated from your town forest goes, because then that gets adopted by the select board, and then there's some sort of a intentionality related to like where that money is going to end up. Because for a town forest, which maybe, you know, some of these are funded, some of these are not funded, town forest committees, some of them are funded to the tune of like a few $100 a year or something from the town budget. If you generate like $10,000, that's like an incredible amount of money. You can use it for all different kinds of stuff within your town forest, or it can get just sort of swept into the town budget where it's a tenth of a traffic light, you know, and it's much less meaningful. And so it's really, really important that you have that I would specifically outline that in the management plan that gets looked at and adopted by the select board, so that money doesn't just get swept away into the budget of the town where it's much less meaningful, right? It should be, you should specifically be saying the money that we are generating, we are then going to put back into the town forest. And so that is the model that I've seen to varying levels of intentionality. Sometimes that just kind of happens. Sometimes it's specifically outlined in a management plan or a forest management plan. I couldn't tell you exactly how many towns do it one way or the other way, but I also know that some towns do it, all the money just goes into the town budget, and then there's just sort of an unwritten understanding that when they need something, they can just ask for it, and that makes me much more nervous. That then when you want to do, you know, you made $10,000 and you have this really advanced invasive plant infestation, and you really want $10,000 to control invasive plants. Is the town going to give you that $10,000? I'd rather have that stay as a line item related to the management of the town forest. I think it's much more safe.
Great, thank you. And we have time for just one more question, and there are a few more here, so I'll send those to you offline. So if your question wasn't answered, I'm happy to send those to Ethan and we could get you your answers afterwards. Yeah. But with our last question, please compare wildlife management areas with town forests. Can town forests protect wildlife from people better than WMAs?
Whoa, yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think the benefit of town forest, right, is again that they are a little bit more agile. I don't think that I can do any management, that the quality of my management would ever be better, you know, than the work that those awesome fish and wildlife folks are already doing at WMAs. I think that one difference could be the amount of that you're sort of talking about in using the term sort of protect wildlife from people is the fact that on many of these WMAs, recreation is restricted or managed very specifically, with the idea that, as we know, recreation, we don't have a lot of good research on the extent to which recreation affects wildlife behavior, but we know that it affects them in some regard, and that probably different types of recreation affect it differently. That's sort of as specific as I can get about it. But on town forests, in many cases, you're balancing many different things. So it's not just a wildlife management area, it's also a recreation area. It's also potentially a town forest demonstration area. And so in that way, it's a little bit harder because you're balancing potentially more different things. That said, I know that there are a lot of WMAs that have really advanced recreation as well. I think that the difference is probably a wildlife management area is a wildlife management area. That's what it's about. Its target is to manage wildlife, and not necessarily to be a multi-use public resource in the same way that towns forests are. I hope that answers that question.
Great. All right, we're just about at 11, so I just copied some of the questions, so we'll make sure we get those answered. But thank you, Ethan, so much for leading us through this discussion. I think there was a lot of enthusiasm for people's next steps. Again, if you are looking for credits, please fill out the survey. Otherwise, happy early Arbor Day. Celebrate tomorrow by getting outside and hugging a tree. And thank you so much for your time. Please follow up with any other questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen.